Welcome back. The late-night comedians are the weather vanes of American psyche, and they've been having a field day with the current financial crisis. According to one, the United States is heading into a new chapter, Chapter 11, an American term for bankruptcy. Another said, God wants his name taken off the US currency that reads, "In God we trust." For working-class Americans, the situation is anything but funny. Although America is the richest country in the world, an increasing number of Americans cannot afford their homes, health insurance, or education. James Kerlock made a documentary warning how the credit card industry swindles Americans of their hard-earned dollars, turning the American dream into a total nightmare. I'll be talking to Professor Robert Manning, the author of Credit Card Nation, which inspired the documentary, after these excerpts.
Bank called me up, they're like, "Hi, we're calling because you don't have enough money." I'm like, "I know." She's like, "Sir, you have insufficient funds." Well, that's a good way to put it too. I agree with that. I find my funds to be grossly insufficient. Thanks for calling. Why are you mad at me? I don't understand what. How is this something I'm doing to you?
To discuss the mindset behind the flawed policies and the economic fallout, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Robert Manning, and of course with us again is Professor Boyce Watkins. Professor Manning, it seems to me that the government that was told it needs to look into corporations to learn how to run the economy is watching a corporation that are corrupt. Then it was told to look for families. It turned out that families, the American families, are in the red. Who's emulating who in America? It seems like this is a nation, one nation, under debt.
You know, one of the striking issues in America is that the very basis of core American values has been the issue of thrift, saving, financial independence, and really literally the role of political independence with financial independence. In fact, many Americans have already forgotten that the American Revolution was partially motivated by the great American planters that were trying to sever very exploitative relationships with European banks. So what we've seen in America is truly a watershed shift in terms of the attitudes where what used to be an earned privilege has now become a social entitlement, and what I referred to in my book is the triangle of debt, where American households have essentially mirrored what's going on with the gorging of debt in corporate America, the extraordinary federal deficit in the government sector, the enormity of the balance of trade deficit with other countries, and now, of course, unprecedented levels of debt in the average American household.
Professor Watkins, people around the world who are watching us, the millions of people, a lot of them live under $1 a day. And America is a rich country. How do we explain that people commit suicide because of debt, that there's so much poverty and so many people are in the red in this country?
Well, it's a perception issue. Americans, most of us, we're very much focused on what happens in America. We don't compare our standard of living to other countries. We compare it to our neighbor. And when I was with the Center for European Economic Research in Germany, I remember one of my colleagues came into my office and he said, "What's wrong with you Americans?" And I said, well, what's wrong with you? You know, and he said, "Well, in Germany, we make less money than you do. We pay more in taxes than you do, but the average savings rate is 5 times greater here than it is in the United States." So that really is a reflection of the culture in our society. Even in my own family, on one half of my family, I had an aunt that was a very successful entrepreneur that spent money as if it were going out of style, and then her husband got sick and the business went bankrupt, and she lost her home.
Right.
And then on the other side of my family, I had relatives that were very frugal and didn't engage in greed, who made far less money, who went through the crisis without a problem. And so ultimately, how you manage your money in America does come down to your values and your personality more so than your know-how and your resources.
But that's what it boils down to, Professor Manning. It's the question that who's to blame for the fallout and for the debt? Some people, and amongst you, blame the swindlers in the system, the credit card companies, or the so-called debt credit card industrial complex. But a lot of people think also that perhaps Americans or that mindset is to blame for that. So many millions of Americans are in debt today. How do you explain that?
Well, you know, if you put it in its wider context of globalization and the tremendous downward pressures and the breaking of unions in America and much of the social contract, the descaling of the social welfare state in America, the real question has been who to blame and how do you get the average American to feel that globalization is actually working positive for them. And what we actually see is a very strong correlation where what used to be the core sector of the American economy being manufacturing, that in the post-industrial economy, the core sector, the most profitable sector is not what you make, but what you finance. Right. And what we've seen here is a very strong correlation in a sense of making Americans believe that globalization is working for them is the availability of this easy access to consumer credit, that it's become a national entitlement as well as an individual entitlement and even a generational entitlement.
And it's financed by foreign countries, isn't it?
That's
the
what's
Chinese,
truly
the Russians.
astounding, is that what you see in America in such a short period of time, since the mid-1990s, we've seen the American savings rate go from about 8% to -1%. And what Americans don't realize is that this relationship means that other countries and societies have to discipline their needs and desires so that they can save and loan to the United States. More troubling, especially with our prior discussion, is the fact that Americans don't want to acknowledge that the enormity of human rights abuses, let's say in a country like China, is what underlies their high savings rates, that fuels the indolent lifestyle of Americans, that those denial of human rights creates high levels of savings that translates to easy credit, which then does not force Americans to become more disciplined, to have a relationship with money and a lifestyle that's consistent with the rest of the world.
Well, that's certainly not an exportable model. You know, we've seen in the last half an hour how America cannot lead by the example of its power. And certainly, from what we hear here, it cannot lead by the power of its example either.
Well, it's not as if, remember, the American economy still ripples throughout the world. We still, whether we choose to or not, have an economic leadership role within the society or the world in which we live.
But do you think that's lasting?
No, I think that it is changing and evolving, but it hasn't disappeared. But what concerns me the most is that America has not been responsible with its leadership role. It has not worked together with the global community. It has been over-aggressive in its role with the Bush administration and military policy, et cetera, et cetera. And so to some extent, there is a change in leadership that's necessary, but understand this recent correction in the market, and I'm not going to call it a collapse or a crisis until it becomes one. This recent correction is something that we've really only been talking heavily about for about 3 months now. So in 1 year, we may not be talking about this. We may be talking about something else.
But we might be talking about a total bankruptcy. And certainly, Professor Watkins, already the Russian stock market had fell by 50%. Mm-hmm. We just heard the Brazilian president speaking about how their hard-earned successes over the last 10, 15 years have been basically torpedoed by the fallout from Wall Street.
Well, that's absolutely true. And, to some extent, further evidence of our leadership role is the fact that every other country is paying attention to what we do and what's happening here. So they understand that whether they like the United States or not, we all have to work together. And what I'm hopeful for is that our leadership will understand that we all have to work together as a global community to overcome this crisis, because whether we like it or not, if the United States suffers economically, the entire world will suffer.
But it doesn't seem like anyone is learning any lessons. Now we're pumping $700 billion to Wall Street, and America's debt is mounting, not receding.
I think what we're seeing here is a collision of different styles of globalization. The American style of globalization is clearly, literally and figuratively, with this crisis, is now bankrupt. And the question is, going from a unilateral, dominant, hegemonic country like the United States has been to a more multi-power nation and global order, the question is now, will America's influence as the future of the global economy recede, or will it become more competitive with countries that can actually sustain financially that perception of the world with a stronger welfare state, with greater public services, with a more long-term orientation, with a national economic policy and set of programs that are consistent not just within that country, but within the larger patterns of globalization, We don't need, as we've seen with the World Bank promoting more and more coffee trees in developing countries around the world, what we need are policies that looks at the global economy in toto and the partnerships that are forged to make this form of globalization successful.
Well, I'll tell you what, next we're going to be hearing from our people around the world about how does the world respond to the fallout on Wall Street. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there, and we'll be right back after the break.